Mary Jane Croft was born on November 19, 1911, in Montana, West Virginia, the fourth of her parents' eventual 8 children. When she was 17, she became Mary Jane Vangilder when she married her husband James. Mary Jane would give birth to 7 children, although only 5 of them survived their births. Twins Alan and Alice were stillborn in 1935. The family lived on a farm along Prickett's Creek outside of Fairmont, West Virginia. By 1943, the Vangilders' marriage appears to have deteriorated. Early that year, Mary Jane moved out of the family home and into an apartment in Fairmont, above the Fairmont Theater. There have been reports that James was abusive towards Mary Jane, but confirming these reports is difficult due to the passage of time, so the exact reasons for Mary Jane leaving remain difficult to verify. Mary Jane worked in Fairmont for about a year before she moved to Ohio. She lived in residences in both Plymouth and Willard during her time in Ohio. In Ohio, Mary Jane was employed at the Wilkins Army Air Force Depot in the town of Shelby, where she worked as a high lift and fork operator. She did not have a car to commute to work, but luckily was able to get rides from coworkers. Mary Jane remained in contact with her children for a time, although that contact was sporadic and gave them little information about why she was living apart from them or about her life in Ohio. In addition to her letters, she would sometimes send them clothes. On multiple occasions, she also mailed them war bonds she had purchased at branches of the People's Bank around Shelby. These war bonds would be the subject of the last communication she had with her family. In January of 1945, she wrote home to West Virginia asking that all the war bonds be sent back to her. Her family did as she asked. They never heard from her again. Mary Jane filed for divorce from James in February of 1945. Her attorney withdrew this petition in April of 1946 after she failed to appear for court proceedings. James filed divorce papers of his own, and the divorce was granted even without Mary Jane being accounted for. He continued raising his children and later remarried and had additional children with his second wife. He passed away in 1985. Because Mary Jane lived away from her family and wrote to them sporadically, they did not report her missing in 1945. By 1949, however, it was clear that something was wrong. In addition, 1949 was both the year that Mary Jane's oldest child, her daughter Anna Mae, turned 18, and the year Mary Jane's brother Lester returned home after serving in the Navy during World War II. Lester went to the sheriff of Marion County, West Virginia, who then wrote to authorities in Ohio. Anna Mae also tried to get in contact with her mother's employer, but did not hear back from them until May of 1952. They informed her that her mother had left her job at the depot on March 8, 1945, citing added household duties as her reason for leaving her position. Anna Mae began writing to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in hopes of getting them to help with the search for her mother. She exchanged letters with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover well into the 1960s, despite his insistence that the FBI did not have the authority to investigate Mary Jane's disappearance, and that Anna Mae would have to rely on the local authorities. In the following decades, Anna Mae would reach out to the Social Security Administration, the U.S. Treasury Department, and the Ohio State Highway Patrol, trying to find a lead in her mother's case. Decades later, the grandchildren Mary Jane never met would comb through obituaries looking to see if they could find record of her death. In 2004, they were able to get an article about Mary Jane's disappearance published in a newspaper in Plymouth, Ohio. Once DNA came into common use in law enforcement, multiple members of Mary Jane's family submitted samples of their DNA to various organizations in case they could be matched to a set of unidentified remains. Mindy Wilson, one of Mary Jane's granddaughters, reached out to Shelby police again in October of 2018. The case was then formally reopened and assigned to Detective Adam Turner. Detective Turner grew up living above his family's funeral home and frequently being around people who were processing grief, left him with a strong sense of empathy. He understood that Mary Jane's family was hurting without resolution in her case, despite the amount of time that had passed, and dedicated himself to solving it, despite the challenges posed by the passage of time. Detective Turner used his own money to pay for trips related to the investigation and appeared on several podcasts on his own time, trying to generate leads. A major avenue of investigation for him was researching unidentified sets of remains to see if any of them could belong to Mary Jane. Over the next few years, Jane Does in multiple states were exhumed so that samples could be taken for DNA testing. None of these Jane Does turned out to be Mary Jane. However, the effort did solve an unrelated disappearance. One of the Jane Does Detective Turner researched was known as the Preble County Jane Doe, whose remains were found in Eaton, Ohio, near the Indiana state line in May of 1968. The remains were exhumed for testing in late 2019. Initial DNA tests showed that the remains could not belong to Mary Jane, but Detective Turner continued on in hopes of identifying the remains, even though they were not connected to his case. He began working with Moxie Forensic Investigations in order to use genetic genealogy to hopefully identify the remains. This effort took 3 years, in part due to pandemic-related delays, but it ultimately revealed that the remains were not those of a woman, after all, but of a man named Albert Frost. His remains had mistakenly been identified as those of a woman because he had been very small and thin, and his remains had been badly decomposed and scattered over a large area when they were found. Albert had served in the military but then turned to a life of crime, allegedly breaking into as many as 100 cars in the town of Hamilton. He moved around a lot, and his family was not always in contact with him, so his disappearance in the 1960s was not necessarily a cause for immediate alarm. He was identified because his great-niece had her DNA profile uploaded to GEDmatch, but she had never even known that he existed until the identification was made. According to Albert's surviving nieces and nephews, the family had heard a rumor that Albert had been beaten to death outside of a bar in Eaton, but the circumstances surrounding his death are still under investigation, with Detective Turner volunteering his time to help. The big break in the case came not from a Jane Doe, but from Mary Jane's complete military file from when she was a civilian employee at the Army Air Force Depot. Detective Turner was able to obtain the file and uploaded it online. Someone he describes as a civilian sleuth who had been following the case brought to his attention a name in the file, Percy J. Sebren. During her time at the depot, Mary Jane had been promoted to high-lift fork operator. She had taken over this position from Percy, so he most likely trained her for her new responsibilities. Percy died in Kansas City, Missouri in 1969 after being hit by a train. A listing on findagrave.com showed that he was buried at New Forest Cemetery in Forest, Louisiana, and listed a woman named Mary J. Sebren, who had the same date of birth as Mary Jane Vangilder, as his wife. Mary Sebren died in 1990, and her grave was in the same cemetery. The Sebrens had 2 sons. Both of them had passed away, but Detective Turner was able to get in contact with some of the couple's grandchildren, who provided photographs of and handwriting samples from their grandmother. Forensic analysis showed that the handwriting samples were consistent with known samples from Mary Jane Vangilder. The Sebrens' grandchildren also provided DNA samples, and when they were compared to samples from Mary Jane Vangilder's known grandchildren and daughter, it confirmed that Mary Jane Sebren was in fact Mary Jane Vangilder. While Mary Jane used the name Sebren in her new life, and she and Percy lived as a married couple, there is no record of them ever being legally married. Mary Jane was also somehow able to get a new social security number for her life as Mary Jane Sebren. Mary Jane's oldest son with Percy was born in December of 1945, 9 months after she resigned from her job at the depot. It appears that once she realized she could be pregnant, she and Percy opted to start a life together immediately, rather than wait for the legal proceedings for her to divorce James to be completed. Mary Jane lived most of her second life in Arkansas. This news was, of course, shocking to both of Mary Jane's families. The Vangilder family obviously felt complex emotions over finally having answers, but also knowing that Mary Jane had departed from their lives willingly and never contacted them again. The Sebren family was shocked that she had such a big secret and was able to keep it for so long. They loved her dearly, and her grandchildren described her as the perfect grandmother, but she seemed to be a perfectly normal woman. She loved to garden and had a particular love for hydrangeas. She was a great cook and made meals for her family. No one in the Sebren family knew very much about Mary Jane's early life, as she did not like to discuss it. When she was dying of colon cancer in 1990, she had told one of her granddaughters that there was something she couldn't tell her and that she could never find out. At the time, her granddaughter had assumed that she was speaking nonsense because she was very ill. In light of this new information about Mary Jane and her two lives, however, she now knows how significant this statement was. Mindy Wilson is one of Mary Jane's granddaughters on the Vangilder side of her family. Mindy was present for the press conference in Ohio, announcing the solving of her grandmother's case on February 12, 2024. Prior to coming to Ohio, she traveled from her home in South Carolina to Louisiana to lay flowers on the grave of the grandmother she never got the chance to meet and had spent so much time looking for. Speaking at the press conference, she expressed her gratitude for Detective Turner and his dedication to solving the case. She also tearfully said, "Our family finally has closure. This search started before I was born. My aunt never gave up hope and is so happy to know what happened to her. This gives me some kind of peace and brings me closer to a woman I never met." During the press conference, in addition to providing detailed information about his investigation, Detective Turner also reflected on what can be learned from Mary Jane's case, saying, "What it shows is that our decisions can reverberate through time and distance and affect generations of our immediate family and descendants, and that our choices in life need to be made in consideration of how it will affect those who love us." Mary Jane's absence left a hole in her children's and grandchildren's lives that was a continuous wound. Questions will always remain as to why she voluntarily vanished from their lives, but at last, the investigation into her disappearance can be, and is, officially closed.